Now, what are the real issues again back in 1860? You don't own and control enough wealth. Why? Because you see, slavery did not happen to black folk by accident. It was inflicted on them intentionally to do something. What was inflicted on blacks to do? It was intentionally inflicted on blacks to maldistribute almost 100% of all this nation's wealth, power, resource, businesses, income, and controls all levels of government.
Now, many times you have always talked about issues affecting blacks across the world, and some of the issues that we have always highlighted is the need for black empowerment. That is, blacks should be empowered, both in the United States and even across all different parts of the world. We are looking at how the income disparity and wealth disparity in America is revealing how blacks are really subdued by the American system. Look at Africa. We are finding out that African countries have lesser GDP compared to the Western nations. So what really is the reason behind everything that is going on? In today's video, we're going to focus on one scholar that has been on this topic for quite some time, and this is Dr. Claude Anderson. Claude Anderson has been very vocal on issues black empowerment, and there is his talk of Powernomics, where he says that when wealth is concentrated among whites, black people will not have any space to really do anything that they want. In this video, I was tracking the wealth disparity that existed pre-Civil War to date, and the findings that he highlighted here are quite breathtaking. One thing that he says is that slavery did not happen by accident. It was made intentionally to socially and psychologically engineer blacks to feel inferior towards white people. He also says that slavery's main intention was to really cement the power and wealth ownership among whites and not black people. So let's watch this video, then come back and share our thoughts together.
You cannot solve a problem. You can solve no problems on this earth unless you first of all understand the history of the problem. The first thing you do as a doctor, when a patient comes into your office, say, what is the history of the problem? Is it peculiar to your family or to your group or to your race? And so we're going to start out this morning trying to go after this, trying to understand black folks' problem in this society. You're black, and we got to go back to the history of it so you fully understand the nature of the problem. You have been misled and bamboozled in this country now for all these years into what the problems are. You have not heard the real problems in this country as it pertains to race. You're going to hear it today if you stay and don't walk out and get mad and get angry and say, he's talking about boo-boo. Here's the problem. That historically in this society, black folk have not moved one iota than where they were in 1860 on the eve of the Civil War. In a comparative proportional term, black people are exactly where they were on the eve of the Civil War. And the eve of the Civil War, at that particular time, we had approximately 300,000 black people that were free in this country, or quasi-free, having come out of slavery. And that was out of 5 million black folk. And that 300,000 black people had mysteriously and miraculously accomplished and acquired one half of 1% of this nation's wealth. Now here you are 150 years later, and black people still only have and own 1/2 of 1% of the nation's wealth after 150 years. Also on the Civil War, eve 1860, we had black people right all over the country. That 300,000 spread out, that was so quasi-free. I looked at the employment rolls. Almost 100% of all those blacks were working in someone's house, someone's plantation, enriching and providing comfort for them. Here we are, 150 years later. 67% to 69% of all black people in America are working in some level of government. Another 26% or so of that, 27% is working in white corporations. Only 2% of the blacks in America are working in their own community for their own people. The unemployment rate in America for black folk is over 50%. When you hear them talking about the unemployment rate in America, they're talking about two things: those individuals who are looking for jobs or those who are collecting unemployment compensation. We have an institutionalized bunch of blacks in America that are no longer in the workforce. That's why 5 years ago, when Obama was running for office, they were talking about the unemployment rate in America for 16%. At that time, the national unemployment rate for black folk was 35%. It was 48% in Detroit, Michigan, 48% in Baltimore, 49% in Pittsburgh, 52% in New York, 88% for black youth. Now, what does that mean for you in terms? There's only 3 things that any given individual can do to earn a living in our society. They either work up here and have a business, or they have a job. They don't have that, they must move down to the second level. When you move down to the second level, you must go on welfare or food stamps or some kind of public assistance. If conservatives come along and knock you off of that, you must go to the third level. You must steal, go into crime. Every individual must either work, go on welfare, or steal. An elaboration, a combination, or sophistication of those 3 things. You can't do anything else unless you evaporate and disappear. We live in a society that don't want to understand it, don't want to play games about it, about how you're going to solve the unemployment problem. You cannot solve the unemployment problem until you go back and address the real issues. Now, what are the real issues again back in 1860? You don't own and control enough wealth. Why? Because you see, slavery did not happen to black folk by accident. It was inflicted on them intentionally to do something. What was inflicted on blacks to do? It was intentionally inflicted on blacks to maldistribute almost 100% of all this nation's wealth, power, resource, businesses, income, and controls of all levels of government. That was the point of slavery. It has never been corrected or addressed. All of a sudden, when black folk came out of slavery in 1865, how did they come out? They came out penniless, poor. No food, no animals, no land, no resources, no tools, no religion, no organization, nothing. All they were told is go out now, you're free, go out and compete. Compete with what? Compete with what? They said, well, you can jump high and run faster. Black folk had nothing coming out of slavery to compete with and to play the game, because you see, slavery had systematically, socially engineered them into the lowest level of a real-life monopoly game. And see, prior to the end of the Civil War, the greatest wealth builder in this nation was the back of a slave. That's what built the wealth of the society. Wall Street was set up and established and regulated off of the price and the value of a slave. Cotton prices, indigo prices, tobacco prices all followed the value of a slave. When slavery ended, the whole process shifted to the back of a slave. At the end of slavery, it shifted to Wall Street. And those became commodities then. And when the wealth building in this nation shifted from the back of a slave to Wall Street, they set up a new game. It was called monopoly. Now, and what black folk have been systematically lured into is a real-life monopoly game. Now, the monopoly game is based on some primary concepts. One is that you must be able to all sit down at the table, and everybody's supposed to get a fair share of the money. Once you get a fair share of the money, then you got a right to go around the table and try to buy land. But you want to buy the most valuable land and the best location of the land. Or you take your money and you buy basic businesses in the monopoly game, like the water company, electric company, and the railroad line. But you see, when black folk, when they got out of slavery, they did not get their 40 acres and a mule, nor the $100. And see, the Republican, radical Republicans, the liberals in the Republican Party at that time said, and that was Benjamin, Thaddeus Stevens, and Sumter said on the floor of the United States Congress, that there's only going to be one thing that black folk will ever be in America. They're either going to be slaves or they're going to be free. But they cannot be free unless minimally they have 40 acres, a mule, and $100. But they didn't get it. But by then they were trapped into a real-life monopoly game. So now what blacks are doing are going around the real-life board, trying to play real-life monopoly with no money, no wealth. And all they do is go around the board and hope they land on free park or income tax refund. And if you play that way, sooner or later playing that real-life game, you're going to land what? On the wrong person's property. And you're either going to go to jail or go broke and get out of the game. And that's why black folk right now are making a major impact on the prison system, the criminal system in this country. Because I looked around in 1860, for instance, I looked at all the major cities in the United States. And that's like Washington, D.C., Atlanta, Georgia, Savannah, Georgia, Richmond, Virginia, New York, Pittsburgh, Philadelphia, Brook. Guess what? Even though you had less than 300,000 black people that were free or quasi-free, black people made up over 51% of all the prisoners. 51% 51% of all the prison, and out of 5 million, only 300,000 of you even free. And here we are, 150 years later, and guess what? You still make up over 51% of the prisoners. So when I hear all my civil rights leaders and all my civil rights friends, I don't care what it's Al or Jesse keep talking about, we've come a long way. You haven't gone any place. And quit BSing people and bamboozling people and black folk about how far we've come. You haven't come any place. You're still sitting in the same identical spot. As my mother would say, you haven't got a pot or one to throw it out of. That's our dilemma. We do not have any wealth. Now, I indicated to you a few minutes ago that the whole process of slavery maldistributed almost 100% of all this nation's wealth, power, resource, privileges, and controls of all levels of government into the hands of the dominant white society. Now, what does that mean in tangible terms? That when you only got 1/2 or 1% of the wealth, how can you compete with 1/2 or 1% of the wealth? When in this society right now, today, 150 years later, the average white person in America as a group got 3,500 times more money than the average black person. The average white has 3,500 times more money than the average black. I got 2 whites right now, some of them I know, they got more wealth than all 42 million black people put together. How if 2 white men got more wealth than all 42 million black folk put together? What kind of game are you playing? What are you going to do? How can you compete? As a matter of fact, let me move it off to men. Let's move it to gender. For every dollar that a black woman has to run a household, the white woman has $100 to run a household. You're supposed to have enough money to be able to be self-sufficient. And this is true all around the world, not just with blacks in this country. If I were to look at you got approximately 25 to 26% of the population is black around the earth. And you got over $300 trillion in wealth on the earth. And out of that $300 trillion, if I take all the African countries, the Caribbean countries, and Latin America, put them together, you still have 1/2 or 1% of the wealth out of 300 trillion. I go down to South Africa, and I've spoken in all these countries, and I've had trade missions in Africa, Nigeria, Ghana, Senegal, Bermuda, Barbados, all these, Venezuela, Colombia. I've been to all these countries, head of trade missions, representing presidents and governors. You can't compete in South Africa. In South Africa, with something like about 29 million blacks as an example, as a comparative example. 29 million blacks in South Africa. You got a little over 2 million whites. But guess what? They own almost 100% of all the wealth in Africa. The 2 million whites. As a matter of fact, in Africa, the De Beers family, one white family, the De Beers family, owns over 50% of the whole wealth of Africa. That means all the gold, silver, chrome, bauxite, magnesium, land, property, everything. And you want to know why they can't make it in Africa? They don't own and control anything. And so in America, if we're going to be a competitive group, we got to go back to what is the basic problem we can deal with. The biggest problem with blacks right now, they own no wealth. They control absolutely nothing. Not in the United States, not in Grand Rapids. I don't have to go around Grand Rapids to find what you got. I can guarantee you right now what you don't have. Or when you go into any city, you figure out who owns the buildings, the big buildings, who owns the communication system, who owns the banks, who owns the railroads, the bus companies. That's where your power is. If you don't control a sufficient amount of that, you are a guest. G-U-E-S-T. You have no power. They can do anything they want anytime you want them. So black folk don't have enough wealth to be a competitive group. You cannot compete. That's the first problem. Now that you know what the problem is. The problem is a lack of wealth. And I'm going to get later on, I'm going to tell you how blacks should start getting wealth. Now, what's the second problem? The second problem is you got impediments that have consistently been used and imposed on black folk to make sure they don't get any wealth. Not necessarily by whites, but what you have in this society, we have a public policy that went into effect in 1867 when the 15th Amendment was enacted. The 15th Amendment says black people can now run for a public office. You can now run for office, but they said you can run for office to be for a sheriff's office, a postal office, or you can even run for Congress or a state legislator. But if you run for a public office and get into the public arena, there are some taboos that you cannot do. One, you cannot run for a public office as a black person and talk about black issues. Point one. Point two, you cannot come in a public office and talk about groupism. You must always talk about individualism, individual achievement. And point three, you cannot come into a public office and try to hold the dominant white society accountable for slavery and what they've done to you for 500 years through Jim Crow, segregation, and slavery. That means you can't have reparations. Now, if any of you try to do it, you'll be charged with racism, or reverse racism. But nobody ever admits you cannot have a reverse racism unless you got a forward racism. And they don't understand what racism is. So when we start talking in a few minutes about solutions, understand clearly that it is impossible in theory and practice for a black person to be a racist. It is totally, absolutely impossible. When I listen to the Fox channel, I say, you can't be that stupid and go to college unless you're using Gorilla Glue and got a certificate for being stupid. You cannot have a black person as a racist. All black people can do is react to racism. They're not racist. Racism is a power concept, point one, and two, it's a group concept. To be able to be a racist, you must belong to the group that has the power and the wealth. And it's a group-based concept. I'm going to divert over for a second just to give you a little piece of information. Racism never existed on the earth until the 1500s. At the same time, capitalism came into effect, and we'll talk about that also. Racism never existed. During the 1400s, European societies were devastated with crime, poverty, and diseases. And when Columbus came back and he discovered America, at that point in time, 9 European nations said, let's now go and enrich ourselves in that third world country. And they decided then, based on slaves that had been brought to Henry the Navigator back in 1443, and given to him, they said, and the Pope then put out a public edict in 1488, saying, if you're going to slave anybody, use what we've learned through the Catholic Church, these black slaves that Henry the Navigator gave us, use them. And so everybody started going around the coast of Africa and picked up these blacks. And they were picking up these black people off the coast of Africa for about $25 a head. And they were bringing them to the New World and selling them in it for a $1,500 return on investment. And then prior to that time, the major form of commerce was called mercantilism. By 1509, it switched off, they started calling it capitalism. Now, this is very important for you all to start learning if you're going to do something in this city. Capitalism, in the simplest definition, in the 1500s, it says learning, acquiring, own, and control the land, the tools, the resources, and use other people's labor to enrich yourself. That's what capitalism is. I'm going to tell it to you again. It means learn how to acquire and control and own the land, the resources and tools, and use other people's labor to enrich yourself. That's capitalism. Now, W.D. Du Bois defined it a little different in 1915. He said that capitalism is like having 3 to 4 years of corn. You eat one, you save one, you sell one, you save the seeds for next year's planting. That's capitalism. Now, in neither of those definitions did any of y'all hear me, and correct me if you heard it. I didn't mention anything about civil rights and social integration. I said it's learning how to acquire wealth, tools, resources, and enrich yourself off of it. But what has happened now in the black community is through impediments is that we've been bamboozled by a lot of the black leadership in this country to having black folk focus strictly on civil rights and social integration. Social integration has failed in this country for black folk. It's the worst thing that ever happened to black folk. Black folk went backwards with social integration. What black folk lost almost everything they had during the process of social integration. Before integration came, and most of my white friends, and again when I say white friends, see I got white relatives, y'all might not know that. And see they jump on me all the time, but you gotta quit saying those things about us. We're not part of that. But I got half my family want to pass a white, I go on fine, do it. But see, social integration is a diluting process, it's a watering down process. And before integration, black people in America had their own businesses. They had their own communities. They had their own schools and churches. As a matter of fact, in the west of Salem, North Carolina, where I grew up, my family was one of the families that was a part owner of a 4-family operation. We owned the only black bus line in America, the only one they've ever had. When I say a bus line, I'm not talking about 3 or 4 buses or 10 or 15 buses. We had over 500 buses. We didn't service just the black neighborhood. We serviced the white neighborhoods too. It was called a Safe Bus Company in Winston-Salem, North Carolina. We took care of the city bus services. In Winston-Salem, the black community also had 2 cab companies. Why? Because the white community had 2 cab companies. The white community had the Bluebird and the Yellow Cabs. Blacks, we had the Harris cab and the Kansas City cabs. We had our own movie theaters, the Lincoln and Lafayette theaters. They had theirs, the Hollywood, the North Carolina theaters, the state theaters. We had our own restaurants and shoe shops and clothing stores and everything. We lost all of that. We even had our own movie produced theaters. We had the Lincoln and Lafayette theaters. In every city in the United States, blacks had the two movie theaters, the Lincoln and Lafayette theaters. We had movie producing studios, Norman Productions down in Jacksonville, Florida, Rishaw in Chicago, and Hollywood Productions making our own movies. They weren't the best movies, but they were ours. But see, when integration came, it took away everything from us. And unfortunately, it wasn't because it was a conspiracy of whites to do that. It wasn't the whites that did that. It was the NAACP. Now, don't go blaming whites for that. Whites didn't jump up this idea about let's go out and force blacks into integration. You see, when down in McLaren, South Carolina, where I used to live, in McLaren, South Carolina, they filed an original lawsuit, became the desegregation decision in 1954. They weren't filing for social integration. They filed it because the black kids were walking to school every day and the white kids were riding on buses. And in my school, in elementary school, we had to spend the first week every year of school cleaning up the old books. The white schools would send all the old books over to our school. We had to clean them and fix them up and take gum erasers and get all the dirt and trash off and put tape on them. We got all their hand-me-downs of everything, for equipment, tools, everything. And so when Clinton, South Carolina filed a lawsuit, they filed it based on what? Money, economics. They're saying it's not right. They've been talking about social integration. The city and the state county was paying what? $1 for every black child to go to school and $11 for every white child to go to school. And that's where the problem came from. It was a maldistribution of the resources and the money. And so in 1970, Governor Reuben Askew, who's a good old Southern who I love to death, Reuben called me down and said, Dr. Anderson, would you come down here and run my schools, run the state system? I became the coordinator of education for the state of Florida from 1970 to 1976, right at the time of desegregation. And when I went to the Department of Education, and I said, look, what are y'all going to do on the desegregation decision? They said, well, what we're going to do, here's our plan. We're going to close, we're going to fire the black teachers, fire the black counselors, fire the black administrators, close all the black schools, bus 75% of the black kids to the white schools, and put the rest in special education classes. I said, no, you're not going to do that. And they said, why not? I said, I don't want you to bust the kids. I want you to bust the money and the resources. Leave the black neighborhood, the black schools alone and bust the resources over there. Give them some tennis courts. Give them some swimming pools. Give them some of the best teachers and best books and learning materials. But again, I got overruled in that by the state legislature. They said the easiest thing for them, they could save money by just letting blacks become guests, G-U-E-S-T, in the white schools. And so consequently, that didn't work. And so we had impediments because our civil rights leaders got bamboozled with that policy in 1867. Then by 1968, it came up again. President Nixon then when he got elected to office, he got a letter from Daniel Moynihan saying, I got a way to shut down the black civil rights movement in the country and shut down the black power movement. He said, what you do, you take the focus in public policy off of black folk and never put it back again. You place it on minority women and immigrants. And so at that point, I was opposed to that, but that's what they did. They shifted the focus, and they call that a benign neglect policy, which means that don't say anything mean about black folk, just pretend that they don't exist. And then they come up with this whole concept called post-racism and a colorblind society.
Now, that speech by Dr. Claude Anderson reveals quite a lot about experiences that black people are having across the world. He has given examples of how Africa is subdued by the whites and the Western nations. He says that, do you want to know why they can't make it in Africa? Because they own nothing. Africa is all owned by whites. What they do is that they came in Africa, created these countries so that they are able to really micromanage our activities and they are able to really control our economies and everything that goes on inside here. So that is why you find that blacks everywhere are subdued and are being micromanaged by whites. He has really highlighted the need for blacks to fight to gain wealth, because that is why they can't speak anywhere. That is why they can't control anything, because he says that the reason why Africans or blacks are being misused or manipulated as it continues to happen is because they own no wealth. And without wealth, you can't speak where people are speaking. So Dr. Claude Anderson, in his influential works like Powernomics, the National Plan to Empower Black America, argues that economic empowerment for Black Americans is essential for several critical reasons that reflect both on historical injustices and current socioeconomic disparities. First one is the historical context. Anderson points out that the systemic racism and policies like slavery, Jim Crow laws, redlining, and discriminatory labor practices have systematically disadvantaged Black Americans economically. These practices have resulted in a significant wealth gap where Black families have far less accumulated wealth compared to their white counterparts. This historical economic marginalization necessitates targeted empowerment strategies to correct these imbalances. There is a lot of wealth disparity and a gap that exists between whites and Blacks. And this has not happened by default, but by design, because whites orchestrated a state in which Blacks remain inferior throughout their lives and whites continue to own the levers of power and wealth. This is what Dr. Claude Anderson is talking about here. The wealth disparity. Economic empowerment is crucial because wealth, unlike income, can be transferred across generations, perpetuating economic status. Anderson highlights that without economic power, Black communities remain in a circle of poverty, unable to access quality education, healthcare, or entrepreneurial opportunities. He argues that without closing this wealth gap, the broader American promise of equality remains unfulfilled for Black Americans. We've always had the creed that says that all men have been created equal before God. But when you look at America and the systems that work within the country, one thing that is evident is that there is a sense in which the system has worked to persecute one race while uplifting the other. White majority and white nationalists within the country have perpetuated a system of control among Black people. And this is something that must be defeated, as has been postulated here by Dr. Claude Anderson. Political influences. According to Anderson, economic power translates into political influence. Without economic clout, Black communities have limited leverage in policy making, which is crucial for advocating changes that directly benefit these communities. Economic empowerment would mean not just having a voice, but the power to influence local, state, and national policies concerning education, healthcare, and criminal justice reform. Another one is also economic independence. Anderson's concept of Powernomics involves creating economic strategies that promote self-sufficiency and economic interdependence within the Black community. He advocates for Black businesses, cooperative economics, and investment in Black-led institutions like banks and schools. This approach aims to circulate wealth within the community, reducing dependency on external economic systems that might not prioritize the interests of Black Americans. I think up to where we have read, Claude Anderson has the love of Black people in his heart. The kind of postulations he's giving here are quite revealing and really shows how much Blacks have been disadvantaged and how much Blacks need to put towards ensuring that their economies are well propped up. It will take Black people coming together and starting against oppressions that they have faced to really have a better improvement of their life. Truly, as has been indicated, Blacks need economic empowerment. Social justice. Economic empowerment is seen as a pathway to social justice. Anderson believes that without economic power, civil rights gains are limited because they do not address the underlying economic structures that perpetuate inequality. He suggests that economic stability can lead to better living conditions, educational opportunities, and consequently, a reduction in crime and social discord. Cultural preservation. Finally, Anderson argues that economic empowerment supports cultural preservation. Economically empowered communities can better support institutions that preserve and promote Black culture, history, and arts. fostering a sense of identity and pride within, which are crucial for community cohesion and resilience. So economic empowerment is the antidote to much of the challenges that Black people face. If you go to the criminal justice system, the high incarceration rate, Claude Anderson says that in America, there are only 3 sets of groupings that a person can fall in. One of them is where you are working and creating wealth so that you survive in America. The next one is living and depending on food stamps, where you'll always be assisted. And the last one is stealing to make ends meet. So he says that with slavery and the systemic racism that has been subjected towards Black people, they have been thrown down to the last 2, where some will depend on food stamps and others will engage in criminal activities to make ends meet for their families. And this will work against them in the long run. So that is why he says that Black businesses, Black organizations must come together to have a strategy through which they can work to sustain economic empowerment among Black communities. In summary, Dr. Claude Anderson posits that economic empowerment is not just about financial gain, but about achieving parity, influence, and dignity for Black Americans in a society where systemic barriers have long hindered progress. His vision is one where economic empowerment underpins all other forms of empowerment, leading to a more equitable and a just society. That is it from Dr. Claude Anderson. He is somebody that I think if you listen to him keenly, you will know why he speaks with vigor and courage and zest for support of Black people. Tell me down in the comment section what's your opinion on this issue. And if you're watching us for the first time, don't forget to subscribe to our channel, like this video, and also share. Thank you, and may the good Lord bless you. Goodbye.